Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for BoF Voices here in New York City in partnership with QIC Global Real Estate and supported by Spring Studios and collaboration with the World Economic Forum. This is our third stop on a global tour following Hong Kong and Sydney, leading up to our first Global Voices event at the Soho Farmhouse just outside London in December. Without further ado, I'd like to start our first discussion. The theme of our latest print issue of BoF, which you'll all get a copy of on the way out today, is a connected world, exploring how living in an interconnected world impacts the way we create and consume fashion. Nowhere has this been made clearer recently than in Europe, which in the last 9 months has been rocked by major terrorist attacks, both in Paris and Brussels. And there has been a profound impact around the world, slowing tourist arrivals not just to the French capital, but across Europe more widely. It's contributed to a pervasive sense of uncertainty around the world, and we've seen that psychological shockwaves from one part of the world can swiftly spread to the other. There is also the Zika virus in Brazil, the wars ongoing in the Middle East, and a bruising and polarizing election campaign here in the United States. All of this is contributing to a climate of uncertainty. And for fashion and luxury brands, which rely on discretionary spending to drive purchases, many of which are emotionally driven decisions, this growing uncertainty can have a dramatic impact on consumer behavior and consumer psychology. So to explore this topic, I am joined by Victor Luis, who has been a senior member of the leadership team at Coach since 2006 and assumed the role of CEO in 2014. Mr. Luis has overseen a gradual turnaround of the business after years of challenges at Coach. And in April of this year, the company announced that third quarter sales, profit, and earnings had all returned to growth for the first time in years, with double-digit growth in Europe and in mainland China. That this rebound in performance has happened in a wider context of macroeconomic uncertainty, slumping consumer confidence, and retail sales is a testament to the strength of his management. Please join me in welcoming Victor Luis.
Thank you. Thank you.
Victor, before we dive into some of these broader macro issues that I was mentioning, I thought it might be worthwhile just starting with the Coach transformation journey that you've been leading over the past few years, just to remind everyone here about the journey that Coach has been on. And I thought perhaps you could just describe to us, when you did take over the reins of the business in 2014, what was the state of the Coach business at that point, and what did you see as the key challenges for the business?
Sure. So obviously I took over as CEO in 2014, and we went into a deep review of the context, but that's not to say that I hadn't been there already for quite a few years and lived through the period prior to my actually becoming CEO. I think that when we look at the Coach brand, you can kind of think of three chapters. We look at our first chapter basically from our founding in 1941. This year we celebrate our 75th anniversary, through maybe the late 90s, maybe early 2000s, where Coach grew to about a $500 million business. And we look at a brand that was in essence born as America's original house of leather, and we sold a few SKUs of unlined leather bags made here in New York City, the vast majority actually, during the period of this first chapter, a little bit in New Jersey, some in Florida, and some in Puerto Rico, but all made here in the US. And then we enter, and that was through the late 90s, and we then enter a period where with my predecessor and a new creative director coming together in the early 2000s, we made the brand a bit more fashionable. We called it, in some ways, the era of the 3 Fs. We added some fashion, some fun, and some femininity to the brand. We diversified. We moved beyond just this idea of unlined leather bags. We added fabric. We added other materials. We added a few licenses with fragrance. Scarves came into the portfolio, sunwear. And basically, that would be from the period of our IPO in the early 2000s through the late 2000s, and we grew dramatically quickly. We saw our business grow from basically $500 million in that period to approximately $4.5–5 billion. And we were the darling of Wall Street. We were the darling of, if you will, the publicly traded, accessible luxury sector that we helped to create here in the US. I think during that period, what we probably were not as aware of was the changing context around us, which happened and continues to happen, which is increasing competition. And that changes who you are and how you're perceived. If you're in the shopping mall alone as America's handbag brand, right? And you put, and I spoke about these 3 F's, fashion, fun, and femininity. And so we had these 2 mannequins in the window for 10 years. For 10 years, these mannequins wore jeans and a white shirt. Blue jeans, ripped jeans, boyfriend jeans, an occasional white jean, but that's all they wore, and a white shirt. The handbag changed. And so on either side of us, if you have competition that's coming in essence, what do? They differentiate and provide something that you weren't at the moment. We thought we were being authentic to ourselves. The reality is we probably weren't as an authentic a fashion brand as we could have been. And other players came in, and they played on their fashion strengths. And so seasonally, they would change. They were looking fresher. They were looking more modern. They copied our white storefront. They copied our feature table presentation inside, the way that we presented SLGs and cubby walls. A lot of it was the same. They may have added some of their own architectural details, a different rug here and there, a different window hanging here and there. But in essence, what you had was an increasing amount of competition, giving consumers a lot more choice. And by the very nature of the fact that we probably didn't evolve as quickly as we should have, you end up looking old, and you end up looking like you're of yesterday and not just today. And quite frankly, during that era, we probably didn't speak to the truth of the Coach brand, our DNA as a house of leather. And so through all of that analysis, we decided it was time for dramatic change. And the key decision was to find the creative vision for the next chapter of Coach, the 3rd chapter of Coach, which we're calling now Modern Luxury, which is for us to evolve and to be our authentic selves. 1, rediscover our history, heritage of craftsmanship as America's original house of leather. And 2, of course, evolve more authentically as a fashion brand. That requires a creative vision. We were lucky enough to find Stuart Vevers, who had the experience of having worked with traditional leather houses and understood craft, understood material, understood design in our core category, but had also helped in his previous experience, had also helped brands transform themselves into broader lifestyle brands, and that's what we've been able to do with what we do now on Runway. And thankfully, look, we've presented a few presentations. The last 2 seasons, we've actually gone out with runway shows for the first time. September of last year, February just passed, where we've also shown men's at Men's Fashion Week in London. And the reviews have been terrific. And what that gives us is the confidence that obviously the changes that we've made are being perceived as authentic to us. If it's authentic, then it's truth. If it's truth, then you repeat until obviously more consumers know and understand the new reality of the brand. And we're very much on that journey. I mean, you touched upon some of the results, but we've moved in North America from what had been a business that was comping at -24 to a business that this past quarter, as you stated, was flat. And globally, continuing to see traction in our businesses in Asia, especially with the Chinese consumer, more recently in Japan for various reasons, especially tourists, and seeing double-digit growth as well in Europe, where we're in the very early stages of our development there. We have a business in China that this year will be $600 million. We have a business in Europe that this year will be about $125 million.
So it's interesting that you bring up, the strategy of Coach, because if I think back to when I first came to know Coach, probably in the late 90s, early 2000s, living in the States, at the time, Coach was a much more US-focused business. And over the past decade or so, as you've taken this global expansion, especially in Asia, as you say, Japan and China primarily, and now in Europe, it poses new challenges for a business that was very well known in this market, but had to build a brand globally and had to build relationships with global consumers. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the context in which we're operating today in the luxury and fashion business, I think, is unprecedented in terms of the amount of change that is happening simultaneously. You have economic stagnation, you have a consumer that's traveling more than ever before, you have more competition, you have the rise of digital technology. So we're living in this period of massive change. How has Coach, in the last few years, as you've been taking this turnaround, how have you been thinking about navigating some of these countervailing forces, and how have you managed to do so in a way where you're actually performing better than most of the industry at the moment?
Yeah, I think first we're lucky that we underwent our transformation, perhaps irrespective, first and foremost, of what was happening from a macroeconomic perspective or some of the other issues that you raised. A lot of the change that you discussed, I've been in this business since 1991, since the early 90s, and I started my career in Japan, which is probably one of the oldest and certainly most mature of the luxury markets, at least as it relates to a lot of the traditional European luxury brands and increasingly for the US brands. And we've seen exchange rates, in my career, I've seen exchange rates go from 120, 130 to 79 at the lowest and back and forth many, many times. We've lived through SARS. We've lived through, I think, some crises in the past, geopolitical issues. The Chinese don't like the Koreans don't like the Japanese, the Japan doesn't get along with China, then they do, and that creates a lot of tensions pretty consistently. And I think that what is always true, even during those short periods, is that you can manage some of the operational details, right? You can hedge. Look, there's some stuff you can do, and everyone has to do it within their business reality. In our case, we're an American publicly traded company. You can hedge currency. You can diversify your supply chain. You can take a lot of operational steps to help you deal more effectively through short-term impacts, whether they be geopolitical, terrorist, tourist flows, currency, or the like. But at the end of the day, successful brands have a direction that they need to maintain. And a successful brand has an amazing narrative that hopefully is somewhat universal, can be translated across cultures, and can resonate with different cultures. And the key focus for us from the moment that Stuart joined us through today, and irrespective of what happens tomorrow in Brazil or China or Japan or with tourists, is going to be about how do we make our brand as emotional as possible and as connected as possible with our consumer. That's the key objective. And I think that for us right now, with a lot of the uncertainty that we have, we ask ourselves a lot of questions. Should we change? Should we not? Do we tack a little bit? And I can point to one example. I shared this one with you earlier, but in 2008, Coach made a decision which probably served us well in the short term. Some of the folks here may be aware, but in 2008, we launched a collection called Poppy, which was an amazing success. It was at right in the midst of the economic crisis, and Poppy was a much more youthful and lower priced collection. And we had a lot of internal debate. Do we launch it as a sub-brand? Do we put it within the main collection just as a collection within the store? And we decided to do just that. And we were, during a year or two, quite frankly, heroes, because the business was helped dramatically by it. The product resonated with a certain consumer. It was lower priced. It brought traffic into the stores. But the impact that it had into the medium longer term on the Coach positioning was not maybe necessarily what one would have desired for us to resonate in a business model that's more sustainable over the long term. And so we think about those decisions a lot. So right now, in terms of just managing in the short term, key strategies for us is, yes, diversify supply chain as much as possible. Yes, of course, look at currencies and hedge currencies as a result. Absolutely think about how we can diversify our business, whether it be different categories. We're very focused in our strategy in developing our footwear business, developing our outerwear business, not just because we think it's a great way to bring a very clear view to who the coach woman or the coach man is, but in those two categories, there are real businesses to be had that makes us less dependent on one category. And then secondly, diversify as well over brand, and we've made a very important decision about a year ago with the acquisition of Stuart Weitzman to bring in new know-how and also bring a new brand to bear with a different positioning that helps us to diversify and bring growth to our business as well. But nothing could be more important than for each of these brands to continue to innovate, resonate, and through the creative vision of the teams, connect with consumers. Nothing. Because that's what's going to help us create a long-term sustainable business model. And that's where the truth lies in the relationship with the consumer, not in the short-term steps that we take. We need to be authentic to ourselves over the long term.
So clearly one of the strategies that you're describing is, making sure that in an environment that's as turbulent and filled with as much turmoil and uncertainty as we are today, not to make short-term decisions that could have potentially do long-term damage, and to have a diversified kind of approach to how you do that. The one thing that you kept mentioning, though, was this connection with the consumer. And sometimes I think in our industry, we talk about the consumer as this kind of monolithic individual or a prototype, when actually now the consumer is becoming more and more complex. And I'd especially like to focus right now on what some people are calling the borderless consumer, or the traveling consumer, because in my conversations with business leaders around the world, but especially in Europe and here in the States, I think there's been potentially an over-reliance on this traveling consumer. And you've seen a shift in recent years as Chinese customers all moved to Japan in the last year or so because the yen devalued, and all of a sudden it was a very good place to shop. There was a lot of focus on serving the Chinese customer in Japan, but the next moment the Chinese customer could be somewhere else. And in the midst of all that, there has perhaps been a slight neglect of the local consumer, building the relationships with the local consumer. Can you talk a little bit about how you also strike that balance? Because clearly that Chinese consumer is a very important consumer to be aware of, but the local consumer, the one who can actually go to your store or your stores on a regular basis, that live in the neighborhood or that are part of the community, those also have an important role. And how do you cater to both types of consumers in a single store environment?
Sure. I think anyone who's benefiting from the traveling consumer has done a good job in a local market somewhere. If you're benefiting from the Chinese tourist, it's because you've done a decent job in China, leveraging, developing your brand, developing your business. Or in Europe, there's some awareness. Yes, there are some consumers that can come and discover you in your home market, but when you start thinking of businesses at scale, if you don't have the local resonance, you're most likely not going to have the resonance with the traveling consumer at scale. It's just a fact. And the first most important market in that way was Japan. If we look at the development over the last 20, 25 years, and all of us who are in luxury fashion world have seen tremendous growth over the last 2 decades. There's been a few key stages of development. One has been geographic, started with Japan, and then the European brands following on a lot of the success that they saw in Japan started developing their businesses here in the US by making their brands relevant to the US consumer, right? I mean, whether it was by leveraging Hollywood or celebrity, whatever they did through collaborations to make their brand resonate with the US were key important steps, because initially a lot of the larger brands had businesses that were 60, 70% Japanese. And by that I mean both within Japan and then traveling abroad, Japanese in Korea, Europe, and some in the US. In addition, after the US then came China, and China's been an unbelievable opportunity for everybody. And obviously, I think there was a time during SARS, right after SARS, when people thought that duty-free and the traveling consumer was going to die. And again, it didn't, because once there was a new consumer, a new market developed in China. They, of course, traveled, and in numbers that we haven't seen anyone else in the world travel, and that's led to business. Most recently, we've seen, of course, traveling consumers from South America, Brazil, and other markets, and with their currency and domestic issues, that's dried up a little bit. Eastern Europe, the Russians, that's dried up a little bit, but you still have, of course, numbers of traveling consumers today, more than we did 10 years ago. The numbers haven't dwindled, they've continued to increase. The year-on-year impact is what everyone's worried about. The American retailers are seeing fewer Chinese because of the domestic issues in China and the currency. We're seeing fewer Brazilians. I don't know, though, that the US brands or the European brands have focused less on the American than they should have. I really don't know. I mean, anyone who is truly thinking about developing their brand globally is focused on a few key markets. There's no doubt that that's still probably Japan, which 2 years ago they probably weren't, but now they're refocused on it thanks to the Chinese. China, some other parts of Asia, Europe, and the US. Those are still the main drivers of global business. And then you have some small pockets, obviously, in the Middle East, Latin America, and a few other areas that are going through some turbulent times today. But long term, I'm excited about the opportunities ahead of us. I mean, when you think about the development that's still to take place beyond China, whether it be, again, India, whether it be Latin America that no one's talking about but will come back, we have to not be too focused on short-term little impact to the business and really think about where it's going to go long-term. And the reality is you've got half of the world is still living in rural areas. China, even half of the population is still rural and urbanizing. In the case of Brazil, the case of obviously India, where you still don't even have infrastructure beyond a handful of malls in India to develop. So I'm excited about what the long-term opportunity brings and focusing on that and creating, again, a structure, diversified as much as possible, that allows us to benefit from that. And the key is, if you focus on the domestic consumer, you'll get the traveling consumer. I don't think anyone is marketing so dramatically just to the traveling consumer. I mean, I don't see a lot of signs in Chinese in New York focusing on the Chinese consumer. We've all made steps of bringing in Chinese-speaking sales associates in certain locations. We maybe all advertise a little bit more on airplanes, but there isn't an undue amount of resources focused on it.
So you're optimistic about the long-term fundamentals then?
Absolutely.
Okay.
As much as I've always been.
Yeah. The other shift that we are seeing is a generational shift. And we were talking earlier about millennials and then the generation below them and the way they relate to brands. How do you think about it? Because one of the pieces of feedback that I often hear is that loyalty amongst this younger consumer, while they're still engaged by brands, they might not be as loyal. And for a brand like Coach, which has a heritage, as you do, the heritage can also become not a burden, but there is a bit of a, well, I don't want to buy the brand my parents bought. How do you stay relevant to this kind of less loyal, slightly more impulsive consumer that's operating on all these different channels, that's like engaging with brands in a completely different way?
Yeah. Well, I when I was growing up, I didn't want to buy the brand my parents bought either. I think that's typical of most generations. I do think, and you nailed it, Imran, when you talked about just the access of information. If there's one very major significant difference that our kids and the millennial generation and obviously the generation following are living with, have lived with, is just the access to information. And that is having a massive impact, obviously, on a couple of very important behaviors. One is how much they study beforehand and how quickly they can compare things, shop digitally before they perhaps even if they do go and then shop physically. The transparency of that information, how quickly it flows. And I think that has a much bigger impact on the amount of choices they have, the amount of information they have, and then the speed with which information can become old because it's there, it's with us. We all carry it with us 24/7. And so does that mean that brands are less important? I think on the contrary. I think what it means is that being different is more important than ever. that the amount of perceived sameness has increased dramatically. And that has a lot to do as well with competition, because whether it's a handbag shape or a material or something in fashion, 10 years ago we were all talking about how fast fashion houses were all taking what was on the runway, bringing it out in 3 months, and they're going to kill luxury. That necessarily didn't happen. Now it's obviously, even at the same price points, everyone references each other, and shapes and colors and materials are, you can go to a department store, or you can go to a specialty store, or quite frankly just walk Fifth Avenue and you try to look for some differentiation. And it's a little bit harder today than it was yesterday for a lot of reasons. First of all, there are more brands. Secondly, they themselves can speak to consumers much more quickly and much more effectively. They don't need to buy 50 pages in traditional fashion magazines to do it. They can you can give your handbag to a celebrity and have 60 million views overnight, or put it on a video, or put it in a music, whatever the case may be, that allows now, I think, an access to information that is unprecedented, that I think will only continue. And so does that change then what one needs to do, a businessman, a brand, a visionary, a creative director, in order to resonate? Absolutely not. I think history is still important. Heritage is important. And quality is absolutely important. And when that's authentic, you win, because they have more information. You can't make this stuff up anymore, right? Because the information is there. You used to be able to go to develop Japan and take it slow and differentiate pricing, and only 5, 6, 7, 8 years later would someone else know about it if they traveled. And now today it's all instantaneous. And so I believe that the millennial consumers are not looking for necessarily anything different than any great consumer would be looking for, especially when they have information. Quality, authenticity, brands that resonate with them and that they believe are modern and fit with their lifestyle based on what they're seeing. They just have different references. My kids grew up in the era of skateboards, so they're more intrigued by what's happening with Supreme, perhaps, than maybe what's happening with a fashion show out of a traditional house. But now a lot of the traditional homes are referencing a lot of street fashion. What's happening in New York or LA or London or Paris. So I think in order to stay relevant, you have to engage with popular culture. The brands that do that well, but are true to themselves, and therefore are perceived as honest to the consumer, will continue to do well.
But how do you stay true to yourself? Because I think, I get the sense it's become quite a formulaic approach that many brands and businesses are using. You see, even now, if we're delivering media or marketing through different channels, it's the same approaches, it's the same models, it's the same photographers, it's the same imagery. Don't you think that the industry needs to be a bit more innovative in the way that it actually thinks about creating content and ideas that resonate with consumers? Because if you're flipping through Instagram really quickly, everyone can see what everyone else is doing. As you say, it's like it's the most transparent that we've ever had. Everyone's got access to the same information. How do you stand out?
Well, look, in 5 years, we'll look back on this conversation and see what's actually changed by looking at the trend. A lot of people are trying to innovate. Show now, buy now, embargoes, not showing product. There's tremendous discussions taking place in fashion today on how brands are thinking about managing their business. And everyone's going to find the road that's appropriate for them. There's zero doubts about that. And people are going to experiment, I think, that within their reality. If you're small and private, you may take more risk. If you're public, you may take a different type of risk. If you're broad and international, you're going to maybe take a different direction yet again, and then depending on the categories that you're in. But there is, I think, more at least discussion than ever before on some of the topics that you've hit upon. And I think what it's going to force, quite frankly, and we will see, as when 5, 6 years, 7, 10 years ahead, the brands that are successful are the ones that have differentiated. There's always room in any category and any space for great differentiated product that has a great narrative and that has a story that resonates, always. So, I just like to look back at, since 1991, having been in this business, when every little chop or every little period, you think things are going to change dramatically. You think that maybe for sure there's a cyclical change in the consumer or in the economy or something that's going to be the end of it. And the reality is it just takes a lot of great vision, tremendous persistence, a great balance between consistency and innovation. Because he who innovates every day and changes every day may not be perceived or giving him or herself the time to actually let the consumer even know them, right? And so you have to have a balance between, one, being, again, truthful and honest to who and what you are as a brand and as a house, what your meaning is to your consumers' lives, and yet at the same time ensure that you engage them, that you delight them, that you surprise them with, whether it's a service in the store, whether it's a new product, whether it's a new experience, whether it's a marketing idea, so that you actually seem like you're bringing value to them in every single way possible that allows you to compete effectively in an environment where their attention span is shorter than ever. Because whether it's what's happening on Instagram, as you mentioned, or any other social media platform, or just the news or email, we're inundated with information much more than we've ever been. And again, it's instantaneous. So the idea of being, I think, in the center of our consumers' lives requires a little bit more work than it did in the past.
Do you think it's opened up an opportunity for people to break out of this existing model, though? I mean, one of the things that we see happening is, I was just looking on our BoF Fashion Week page, where we regularly are tracking all of the presentations and shows that are happening all over the world. And right now, I think we have 3 sets of shows coming in. Some are for cruise 2017, some are for autumn winter 2017, and some people are only revealing their images for the clothes that are hitting the stores right now. I mean, it seems like we're in this kind of moment where everyone's deciding to do their own thing. And maybe that's a good thing. Maybe people should feel more comfortable with trying out new models because this old model seems to be stuck.
Again, I think each brand's I'm going to give you a politically correct answer. Each brand's going to try and find its own road. But the reality is most consumers, 99% of the average consumer, go and ask them what cruise is, what fall winter is, what spring summer is, whether they've seen the shows or haven't seen the shows. And yes, look, the most fashion forward consumers that are highly engaged, and those who maybe influence a lot of others, maybe, but generally they don't. And so we know that Fashion Week, and this is our view, my view and Stuart's view and the view of us at Coach and indeed with Stuart Weitzman, is that we know that Fashion Week is about us telling our story to a couple of key constituents. First and foremost, we tell our story to our own internal team. They need to understand, our teams need to understand what we stand for, what our vision is, who the coach woman and coach man is, and how he or she is evolving. 2, we want to tell our story to retailers, to partners. We believe in a multi-distribution, multi-tiered distribution approach and multi-channel, and so we're engaging with specialty stores and department stores across the world, and we want them to know who we are. And they can't come in and buy now, see now. They're planning their business as well, like any great business is, ahead of time. They have an annual planning cycle, a seasonal planning cycle, they have an open to buy, and if they're going to engage with us for the next season, we need to show them product for the next season, not for now and say we can deliver today. And if we did, imagine if we did, and if we did, then what does that mean? If I'm going to give them something now, I've planned it, I've bought it, I've manufactured it, and it's sitting in my warehouse. So someone has to do the planning 6 months ahead. There's no way to avoid that, right? We're not yet at the period where each of us has a 3D printer in our home, which would be the end of third-party distribution, and we can press the button, and there it is. It's just come from a 3D CAD, beautiful picture. You don't even need to prepare a sample, perhaps, and you print it in your size, and you wear it out. Technology is not at that point. So I believe that there are some limitations, and one of the key limitations is time. It still takes, depending on who and where you are, at least for most of us at the premium end, anywhere from 9 to 12 months to go from the idea to getting a great quality product where you even maybe develop materials and then go to the detail and look at them and then say, I'm not inspired by that color of that stitch. I want a different color, or I want different spacing. And through that experimentation is how you get something that truly inspires people quite often. So I don't know yet how we're going to shrink that much shorter, at least in the next short to medium term. So, and then the third party, obviously, that we deal with during these fashion weeks is the press. And there's short-term lead press, and that's what's providing a tremendous amount of stress to the system, because they see it today, they show it today, but the consumer's not getting it until 6 months, 9 months down the road. And that's created a tremendous amount of discussion that, quite frankly, I don't know if there's one answer for. I think some brands are still going to show today for spring, summer, and they'll show in September for spring, summer, and they might have a few items that they've pre-bought and put on runway, and some won't, and some will do just that. They'll plan 6 months ahead and show it. But it still means that they just had the exercise 6 months before. You can't avoid it.
Okay, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about the current American situation, which, there's this kind of conundrum. If you look at all of the macroeconomic fundamentals here in the States, low unemployment, a generally stronger economy than has been, the case for years, especially after the financial crisis. If you look at the numbers, if you look at the retail spending, consumers are still not returning to spend in droves. And I've been trying to pick apart this problem with lots of different people as in the last few months, as this problem has become more and more clear, as we've seen month after month, waiting for these results to shift. And no one's been able to really give me a clear answer, but I thought I would try with you as well. What do you think is going on here in America with the consumer? Because on the face of it, it seems like things are hunky-dory. It seems like we should be in a state of higher levels of consumer confidence than we've seen. What do you think might be happening?
Yeah, I don't know if there's one specific data point that one can point to the health of the American consumer itself, right? Obviously, in our space, there's a lot of discussion first and foremost on the topic that we discussed earlier, which is the tourist and the impact of the tourist. So year on year, with fewer tourists, retailers, specifically in their larger stores, seeing reduced sales to that consumer which was here and is no longer here. And then that speaks to the second question. If you take that out, what is happening with the American consumer itself, or him or herself? And I think there's a lot of hypotheses, and quite frankly, I wish I could give you one clear answer, but obviously what one reads and hears and what we all discuss a lot about is what is happening in terms of, perhaps at least in our businesses, in the fashion space in general, is maybe there is increased competition, increased amounts of inventory in the channels, obviously increased promotional activity as a result, and what that means in terms of what consumers are accessing. Does it mean, and obviously what the web does on some of these promotional channels as well, because and I don't have the answer to this, we put a lot of analytics behind it, but are the number of units being sold still increasing because they're just at a lower price point, but we see the prices leading to, of course, a lack of growth that we would normally see on the top line in dollars as a result, and I think that's one major question that is out there. And then the idea of uncertainty. There's been a lot of discussion about uncertainty as it relates to the election and other things. I'm not sure of that, quite honestly. When I'm out talking to our team in stores and what they hear and don't hear from the consumers, I think there's just a lot of desire for consumers to be inspired by newness. And when there's been more fashion is when we've seen the consumer, quite frankly, engage the most. And so we're excited by the steps that we're taking in that direction. And consumers looking, again, just to be inspired. And with so much competition, so much, I think, attention focused on pricing, you have to get beyond pricing, get to emotion, right? And the only way you're going to do that is by giving them stuff that are new and exciting to them that they haven't seen, that makes them interested in obviously shopping. And I think this last holiday season that was reflected as well. I don't know that there was a lot of discussion about, and I'm not just talking in fashion, whether it be in technology or other categories even, there wasn't a tremendous amount of excitement about that it product or that it gift or that emotional thing that I think families and friends and others were talking about and gifting to themselves as had been the past in past seasons. So we're in a little bit of a lull perhaps on the innovation front.
The one thing that you mentioned that kind of strikes me is discounting. And it seems to me that perhaps we've been training consumers to wait for discounts. In this period where price became such an important consideration, discounting became the easiest lever to pull. And Black Friday is a great example, which has become this massive splurge of competitive discounting at levels probably that we hadn't seen before. Why do you think we ended up down that road, and how do we get out of it? Because if the consumer is expecting to wait or waiting for discounts before they buy.
Well, often, look, if you end up with sameness and the only thing differentiating you to that consumer is price, then competitive pressures will often lead to that, right? I think at the root of maybe some of the more recent trends, we can go back to 2008 and 2009. I mean, the discussions of what was happening during the crisis, and that gets to the original point of our discussion, which is how does the macro environment impact business, and what decisions do you take that maybe solve short-term issues, but if you're not careful, create other long-term trends. And for every brand, at the end of the day, if all you're competing on is price, we know what that leads to. I mean, it is a very slippery slope, and next year you may end up having to give more, and unless you can break through, I think, the pricing battle through, again, great product, great brand resonance, and truly engaging with the consumer in a different emotional way. Emotion always trumps price. That's a fact. I mean, if you have a brand that people truly desire, we have seen, and there are many examples today in all kinds of categories, where if you're desired and you're able to manage your pricing and manage your distribution effectively, consumers will engage with you. And that, I think, is going to have to be the journey that each and every single brand is faced with today. And so a lot of the discussions that we end up having are, right, well, if we can manage it in our own stores, how do we manage it with third parties and engage with them effectively, but not losing sight ever of what we're trying to do in the medium to long term, which is every season we need great product. We're transforming our stores. We have 1,000 stores across the world. We've invested hundreds of millions transforming, by the end of this month, 400 of them. We've got another 600 to go. We're staying on that journey. It isn't a halfway road, right? We're not going to leave half the stores in the white box format of the past and half in the new format. And our marketing. We've brought a lot of other creative talent to bear around Stuart, whether it was with Fabien Baron and his team, and Stephen Meisel and Carl Templer on styling, bringing together a community of creative talent that helps us continue to develop, and that provides Stuart with a partner or a group of partners in his vision to continue to develop the brand, and continuing with that investment so that they challenge each other again to innovate and continue to evolve, while having, yes, a certain seed, as I mentioned earlier, a certain seed of truth that is the Coach DNA that is always there, that the consumer can understand and follow.
So, to sum up, it sounds to me like there are no clear answers. Diversification is good. Thinking and balancing the short term with the long term, and also maybe that creativity is more important than ever before, because if copying and everything can be copied very quickly, store formats, marketing campaigns, you name it. The one lever we have that really differentiates things, the one thing that brings out emotion, is the creativity of our products. So you and I were talking earlier actually about the power of creative talent, and how the war for talent and creativity and the right talent is tougher than ever in our industry. And I'm just looking at the brands that are currently really resonating with the consumer, the ones that are bringing out that emotion, the ones that are not having to discount, and those are the ones that are making big creative impact. Thank you.